Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am calling to order this meeting of the Zoning Board of Appeals. We are here on a 40B application for 1180 Boylston Street. My name is Mark Zuroff. I am sitting as chair tonight. Serving with me on the board tonight is to my left, Randolph Mecklejohn, to my right, Johanna Schneider, and to her right, Lark Palermo. We are the board constituted for this particular hearing. Tonight we are hearing from the geotechnical peer reviewer based on the report that had been submitted by the applicant. Maria, would you like to tell us where we stand with the staff?
Sure, okay. Maria Morelli, Senior Planner, Planning Department. Our last hearing was June 19th, and we had 3 peer reviews. That was architecture, parking, and traffic. This evening, we have geotechnical, which is typical when we do have below-grade construction for a subgrade garage. In this case, the site of 1180 Boylston, it's a remediation site. It's the site of a former gas station. We certainly want to look into not only the bedrock issues, the groundwater issues, the soil characteristic, but should there be any hazardous materials. In this case, because the applicant has purchased the site, the former sushi site at 612 and 614 Hammond Street, we are concerned about protecting abutting structures. And that's something that Commissioner Bennett, Building Commissioner Dan Bennett, who's not here this evening, just wanted to convey to the ZBA that it would be helpful, as we did for 1299 Beacon, that 40B project, to look at a little bit more than we typically would at construction means and methods and foundation methods. And I think you'll also hear that addressed this evening amongst the peer reviewers. So the ZBA charge last time was regarding the south facade, which is, obviously where the sushi site is now, and we'll be seeing revised plans September 11th. I do have those revised plans to distribute.
Okay, are they on the website?
They're not on the website yet. I'm just reviewing them for any questions, but I'll be posting them in about a day.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we are now going to call upon the peer reviewer to present his findings and his report. And then
Excuse me, I just wanted to point out that since it's been a while, Mr. Flynn of GEI, who's the applicant's consultant, did a pretty extensive follow-up report for this modified comprehensive permit. He has about 7 slides, so maybe if we could just go through those before our peer reviewer, would that be okay?
It doesn't matter to me who goes first, so.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Just identify yourself for the record and you can go ahead.
Thank you. For the record, Michael Flynn, GEI Consultants. I'm the geotechnical engineer for 1180 Boylston. As Maria mentioned, this, and as most of you are aware, this is a project that was approved by the board in 2017 with conditions. However, there have been changes, and with those changes, we've made some revisions to recommendations that we've made and just updated the report accordingly. I'll try to keep this quick because it's really a recap and just kind of a summary of the changes. But so in 2015, we prepared a geotechnical report. We recently updated that report and provided it to Brookline. And the changes in that report were some trivial. Since the 2015 Mass Building Code had been updated, so we made revisions to update that. We've included some supplemental explorations that we prepared to understand the adjacent foundations a little bit better. But the bulk of the revision is to address the revised exterior foundation layout. And this is including the 612, 614 Hammond Street location. With that change, also the depth of the basement, most particularly in areas where there are pits for parking lifts, reduced to 25 feet. We'll go through that in a little bit more detail. Overall, our geotechnical recommendations haven't significantly changed as part of this report. It's really been an update of what we previously recommended. So I think you guys have seen this on other meetings, but just to give a rough layout, the left is the 2017 parking level. And on the right is the new level. You can see on the bottom left where the main change is. And what this is allowed, what you might not necessarily see here, and what this is allowed is, on the 2017 version, there were some deep pits associated to have benefit parking. We've been able to eliminate those and essentially do 2 levels all even across the site. This eliminates some complexities, eliminates the deeper pits that were going around 33 feet deep, and it's overall simplified the job some. But what did we see back then? The site, typical to sites in this area, has urban fill at the ground surface and the near surface. And a little bit unique to this, as Maria indicated, is we've got bedrock that is 2 to 24 feet below grade. And what that means is when we perform excavations, we're going to be encountering that bedrock and moving it. And in addition, groundwater is around 8 to 11 feet below ground surface. As far as structures on the site, or adjacent to the site, there's 517 Heath Street and 521 Heath Street. Each of those have garages on the back side. This is the south side of the site. I don't have a pointer, but here we go. Here, and those are slab-on-grade garages that are almost abutting the property line. In addition, 1162, 1164 Boylston, way back when we originally did the geotechnical report, we were able to get into that basement. It's got a partial basement, just half a floor deep. I think it's 3 or 4 feet deep. And we assume that's on shallow foundations. That's likely the case considering the building size and the most conservative assumption. And then similarly, the 616 and 624 Hammond Street, so now this is south of the 612, 614 Hammond. We were recently able to get into that basement to understand it's 1-level basement, and similar to Boylston, we assume it's on shallow foundations. That's just a building that size, that's what it's going to be on. So what did we recommend? We recommended a structural mat foundation. Basically what it is a big concrete slab that bears on the soil and takes the load from the building and transfers it into the soil or rock. We're recommending that it bears on the glacial tills or bedrock, and that is thick enough to resist the hydrostatic pressures. Counter to making it thick enough to resist hydrostatic pressures, which is like 17 feet of water, you could do tie-down anchors to help resist the uplift. On the exterior, we're it's likely going to be secant pile walls, which would be a supportive excavation and a foundation. I've been in front of this board before and I talked about secant pile walls and what they were, but it's overlapping drilled shafts, essentially to create a continuous wall around the site. In some areas, particularly along the Route 9 side, it may be impractical to actually install that in that area, and so we might end up with a micropile and lagging supportive excavation and then just your typical cast-in-place foundation wall. And then the excavation will be braced internally. What that means is struts, big pipes, and I-beams, wales, in the excavation to help hold it up. And in the middle picture, you can kind of see corner braces, what that kind of looks like. This is a site that had a similar excavation depth, 25 feet, a building right next to it that we performed in the past. And so this is a good example of kind of what you would expect to see associated with that excavation. And then, as I mentioned, rock is shallow, so there's going to be a pretty significant amount of rock excavation associated with the site. A previous condition was that no blasting could occur, and that's going to remain as part of this project. So that means rock excavation is going to be limited to hole ramming and jackhammering, or they could also pre-drill and split the rock. It could be some combination of the two. So, as Maria mentioned, whenever we're performing excavations next to adjacent structures, we need to perform monitoring and we need to be considerate of how to protect and limit movements. And there's a couple ways we can do this. The first, for the internal bracing, when we've got long spans, we jack load into them. Basically, we force load into the pipes early. What that does is it takes movement out initially, so that when load from the soil comes onto the wall, it doesn't have any initial movements. Similarly, we're going to do some monitoring. That would include some pre- and post-construction surveys. vibration monitoring at the existing structures, the nearby structures, and monitor movements on the excavation in the structure. So we monitor movements with monitoring points. You can kind of see it on the top right here. Basically survey prisms that you can monitor how X, Y, and Z of how the wall and the buildings are moving. And similarly, this is what the vibration monitor essentially looks like when it's outfield. And then finally, we monitor groundwater inside and outside the excavation. That's, again, to keep it short, that's what I've got for you tonight. Just kind of a recap of what this project is and the summary of the changes that have occurred. With that, I'll turn it over to you guys or your peer reviewer if you guys have questions.
I have a couple of
Yeah?
questions, not being a scientist. If I'm not mistaken, the prior plan had, and I may be using the wrong terms, reservoirs for retainage of water that accumulates underneath or aside?
Sumps. I think you're referring to sumps in the basement? Yeah, so it's likely that sumps will still exist. Sumps are generally, like a 2x2 size excavation.
Are you referring to sumps or the groundwater recharge?
Maybe both.
There were groundwater recharge tanks previously, and that will still remain the case, but the overall treatment of the site remains the same from that perspective.
All right, so in other words, there are facilities there to hold the the rainwater until it's dissipated.
We're required to do so.
Correct.
And is your plan, since you're building this basically waterproof vessel to keep the building, how does this affect the neighboring properties? Because all of that displaced groundwater is going to have to go somewhere, right?
No, and in fact, it's the opposite. What we're doing by waterproofing and creating a bathtub is preventing water from getting in. When we allow water to get in, what you can get is drawdown. Essentially, the neighboring properties and the site wants to act similar to a well and start drawing down everything nearby. The procedure that we have here with waterproofing and a slab and hydraulically resisting the load is essentially creating the bathtub you talked about and preventing that drawdown.
So will the flow of water affect the neighboring properties in any way?
We shouldn't see any change to the neighboring property groundwater conditions.
Okay. All right. That's my question. Thank you.
I have a question. Are you planning to dewater the site during construction?
Yes, yeah, so
And are you concerned about the impact that might have on the neighboring properties?
it's something that we're going to monitor, particularly on the side of the shallow structure, of the shallow foundations, the buildings, which is why we're considering secant pile walls on that side. It's for two reasons. A, they're just a more rigid wall system. They help prevent movements. And B, they provide a better cutoff than most systems. We are going to monitor the water levels as well to make sure that it's not drawing down. But, anytime to get down temporarily, you're going to have to dewater, so.
Anything else? I just had one sort of related, I was looking for, I couldn't find a site plan in my packet, but you talked about the different, how about that? The abutting buildings along the south side, the ones on Hammond Street, the other ones with little garages, but, do you know how close the foundation wall, the one-story building is of the one on Hammond Street is? Is it so close that you're going to be exposing it, for example, during construction operations?
So it's, we do have it, I believe it's a couple feet off the property line.
Right.
When it was 612, it was right on the line, and we had actually done some
Right.
test pits on the edge of that to understand where the foundation was, because we were going to be exposing it.
Mm-hmm.
This, I believe, I don't know the exact line, but, so there's an alley in between, I think the property line.
Like you could walk in a little slot.
Yeah, exactly. So I believe that there's a couple feet, it's a couple feet off.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from our peer reviewer.
Good evening, Dan LaFrance from Fuss & O'Neill. So I reviewed a couple of different documents in the course of my peer review, namely the revised geotechnical report that GEI prepared this past summer, as well as a summary memo prepared back in February, and a set of site plans prepared around the same time, including the basement foundation plan that is shown on this slide as well. And I do have a few comments on generally the proposed changes to the site layout, and a few about how the project changes overall affect the existing approval, and a comparison of current conditions with the existing approval. The first thing that I would like to pose as a question to GEI and the team that is assembled here is just in regard to the thickness of the foundation wall that's shown on this plan. It appears to be about a 1 foot thick foundation wall the whole way around the building. I may not be understanding quite what I'm seeing because, you know, this is an architectural plan. It's not a structural layout per se, but I am just curious as to whether that's been coordinated with the concept of using secant piles, which generally are, you know, somewhat larger dimensions in that instance. So,
Yeah, our plan, this is Pearl Pandia from the CDT. Our plan is to use 2 foot thick foundations. This was a graphic drawing we had created to submit for the graphic changes between the 2017 and 2019, but in coordination with structural and whatnot. We're off the property line by, I think, around a foot, and the foundation wall itself is 2 feet to accommodate the secant.
okay, thank you. And the one thing that I would just point out to the board at that point is that expanding the thickness of the foundation walls is going to affect the geometry of the garage. I assume that the resubmitted plan set will address those conditions as well, and that will be the subject of, you know, peer reviews by others. But just with changes to the site geometry, that was the one thing I wanted to confirm there. But thank you for that. And basically, so the existing Hammond Street property, so to step back a little bit, the 1180 Boylston Street property has an extensive environmental case file. There is, you know, gasoline contamination from historic site operations there. It was a gas station for over 50 years, and the soil and groundwater, and to some extent the bedrock, have been contaminated by gasoline hydrocarbons. So a lot of our previous peer review was focused on management of remediation waste. That's the Mass Contingency Plan environmental cleanup program term for contaminated soil generated as a result of either a cleanup action or construction on a contaminated property. And so a lot of the previous approval was built around managing that kind of condition. Cumberland Farms is still the, you know, responsible party, and again, that's a regulatory term. It refers to the party that is legally liable for the original release and the cleanup. And, you know, the applicant has rights as property owner to come in and, you know, do construction work within that property, either by taking on the liability for the project or asserting status as what the state calls an other person, namely someone who did not cause or contribute to the contamination but is working around it as part of a larger project. Construction dewatering we had previously talked about as a you know, short-term dewatering to manage the water to keep the foundation from collapsing while they were trying to excavate for it, and then creating a waterproof foundation system at the end so that contaminated groundwater does not flow in and that long-term dewatering is not required. The alternative would be to have developed sort of a long-term pumping and discharge into the municipal storm sewer system, which, when you have contaminants in your groundwater, becomes a difficult and costly process to manage. Not to mention a load on the municipal storm sewer system that it should not be taking those contaminants. It's generally untreated water that discharges to wetlands. You don't want gasoline hydrocarbons breaking through that and contaminating offsite properties. So the Hammond Street property does not have an environmental case file, but that same regulatory framework will continue to exist. And it, you know, as part of the process for going forward, you know, GI is going to have to, or the applicant's team is going to have to do some level of soil testing in order to find a home for that material to go off-site, because they're talking about taking those 3,000 or so square feet and cutting that down to an equivalent level. So there will be some level of testing to do just to find a home for that soil. And GI, in their memorandum from the end of February, commented on what that proposed plan would be. It's impossible to do the soil testing with buildings in the way, so that would have to wait until later in the project, but they did spell out a fairly thorough and robust plan for soil testing to evaluate any of those kind of conditions. In terms of legal responsibility for any cleanup obligations that come into that, the applicant as property owner, when the condition is identified, should a condition be identified there, will be the responsible party. And so there's, an obligation that doesn't necessarily stop when the construction site is done, although I would anticipate that the major issue there would be the urban fill condition, which one of the, I think, 5 case files associated with the gas station dealt with the presence of urban fill containing lead and ash compounds and things of that nature. It would not be unheard of to find the same thing on this other property, and then removing that soil and disposing it off-site would get to a point of closure. GI acknowledged those obligations as it pertains to environmental assessment and cleanup on the adjacent property. And the process that they laid out was thorough and addresses those obligations under the state program and the state regulations.
Can I ask a question?
Sir.
Just on backing up a minute ago, you said the Hammond Street property didn't have an environmental case filed. Is that the additional, the Mr. Sushi
Yes.
property? Okay, so
Yes, it is.
is it, in your opinion, or from data you have from the field, are the soil conditions and the level of soil contamination just expected to be similar on that property, and it just wasn't captured in a previous, in previous conditions and so on?
Yeah, so Mass DEP has a term that they dub anthropogenic background, and basically it's a sort of catch-all term for soil in the urban setting. So anywhere in or near some of the major cities in the Commonwealth, it's very common to find that there's been fill material placed at sites as part of many generations of development, a lot of which was placed before there was any sort of regulation about what can and cannot be in soil on construction projects. And so it was quite common back in the day that people would throw out ash from their heating systems and things like that, and it would just wind up mixed into the soil, and that ash contains things like arsenic and polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are unburned residues from products of combustion. And so those kind of contaminants are very common in soil in the urban setting, and that's just kind of everywhere.
Right, but what I think you were saying also that there was specifically gasoline contamination of the soil on the Cumberland Farms site.
That is correct.
And do you assume, and does it matter particularly, whether those same conditions exist on this site that's immediately adjacent to the Mr. Sushi parcel?
I mean, that will be identified if, as part of the soil testing program. It's
Okay.
fairly easy to find it. It would be kind of rolled into the same construction project, and it basically remains Cumberland Farms' obligation to clean up contamination wherever it has migrated to. So in fact, this gas station, as I said, there were impacts to groundwater that actually extend onto the next block, and so there's a long-term monitoring program that deals with that. That is Cumberland Farms' obligation.
Is it their obligation to, suppose they get to the property line, at one of the back of one of the Heath Street residential properties with the garages on the slab on grade, if gasoline contamination in the soil is, appears to continue across the property line, are they obligated by law, by the state, or by any condition we might impose to carry on chasing it down across the property line?
Yes, so Cumberland Farms would continue to have that obligation. The definition of disposal site, the way that Mass DEP defines a point of release and the area of impact that emanates from it, is that you have to chase it out as far as it goes until you've identified a condition of no significant risk. And so it's not bound by property lines, it's not bound by even contaminant concentrations necessarily. you have to find where it goes and then make a risk determination based on that. But that obligation would rest, as I said, with Cumberland Farms as opposed to the applicant. The applicant is responsible to the extent that there's gasoline in the soil for managing the conditions within their construction project. But Cumberland Farms maintains obligations that extend well beyond their property lines on this site.
And wouldn't it be the case that in connection with whatever RTN Cumberland Farms is responsible for, that the extent of the contamination probably already has been measured and identified?
Yes, so there was a comprehensive site assessment performed as part of that project to get to the condition that they're at. They basically are at a point where they've removed what they deem necessary at that point to get to a condition of no significant risk based on the site conditions as they existed, and they're monitoring groundwater off-site. They do have other obligations, and this is something that may come up during the course of this project, that there is a passage in the MCP, the Mass Contingency Plan, the cleanup regulations, that before you can build a permanent structure over a contaminated site, you have to perform whatever assessment and cleanup is necessary to assert that the cleanup is complete, or at least complete enough to establish an activity and use limitation if that becomes necessary. So there may be an element of coordination between Cumberland Farms and the applicant as far as when they've, excavated down to final subgrade, there may be some additional testing that Cumberland Farms will need to perform for their own reasons to ensure that they can perform the paperwork, down the road when it comes time for them to close the site, to say, we got the source area out and here are the conditions at the edge of that project.
And I just don't remember from our first go around with this. Is there an AUL on this site right now?
Not to my knowledge.
Mr. DeHonda, is there an AUL on this site?
There's an AUL. So an AUL.
I don't know offhand either, it's been too long.
I don't believe there is one, and regardless if there was one of the things that you could do with an AUL is on a project like this, you can actually retract the AUL if you can demonstrate that as a result of the project, the AUL is no longer necessary. So if the AUL was, for example, to restrict exposure to shallow soil, and then you've removed all of the shallow soil that's affected by petroleum, you no longer need the activity and use limitation, you cancel it effectively. So there is a process for that, and that would have to be done by the LSP of record, whether working for Cumberland Farms or the applicant. That's for them to determine.
I have a question. Based on what you know now about this site with the DEP reports, et cetera, what do you think the chances are that there will be a need to install a long-term pumping and discharge system?
I don't think that will be necessary. At this point, there is no long-term pump and treat kind of activity going on here. And what is happening, petroleum hydrocarbons will biodegrade over time. And so after removing the tanks and removing the source material, and especially after over-excavating to accommodate a foundation of this size, basically there's nothing left behind it to continue contaminating the groundwater. And so the contaminants that are in it will dissipate from points of high concentration to points of lower concentration, and then they will biodegrade naturally over time. And that's sort of been the case for the last several years, I think since 2011 or so. That has been Cumberland Farms' approach, has been they removed a lot of source material and they're letting it biodegrade. So this project, by removing additional material, will just cause it to biodegrade and biodegrade faster even. And in terms of having to install any kind of long-term dewatering control on the site, one of the conditions that was explicitly built in during the previous approval was the waterproof mat slab and the waterproof foundation, which is basically the options are either you waterproof the whole thing or you're constantly pumping water out, which becomes an operational headache, and if equipment breaks down, your basement floods and that sort of thing. we pushed for a design that didn't involve active dewatering for a lot of reasons, and that continues to be part of the existing approval.
Anything else?
Yeah, so in terms of the rock removal, GEI talked about there would be jackhammering as basically the primary mechanism, one of the potential mechanisms for removing the rock. Just because there are residential properties immediately abutting the site, one thing that I would recommend is some sort of noise monitoring, at least at the beginning of any rock removal, to basically confirm that that's not creating extraordinary noise at the property lines, and potentially to put up some sort of mitigation measures, some sort of screening at the site or something that would deaden the noise so that it's not an issue off-site. So just to confirm that that's not going to be a long-term issue.
Did the proposed scope of rock removal in the work change materially because of the redesign?
If anything, it actually was less because, Mike talked a little bit about how there had been these sumps
Right.
for the stacked parking units, and now it's just sort of a flat foundation, and portions of the excavation would have been 36 feet or somewhere around that depth before. Now are going to be significantly shallower, 23, 25, something in that general range. So a lot of the deepest rock removal will be cut away.
Mhm.
Just looking through here to see if I have anything else. So I had put a comment in here about there were some potential options for underpinning the adjacent properties and putting in the excavation support in a number of different ways, some of which seemed like they might be a little bit riskier along the property lines and asking for a little more detail. It would seem with a secant pile foundation wall where it's cast in before you start excavating and you've got a solid wall to work around, that you don't necessarily need to worry as much about soil undercutting the foundation as it would with sort of lagging materials that are put down on top of soil and at the soil rock interface may have some gaps. So I'm satisfied to that comment regarding the excavation support, that secant piles, to the extent that those are employed, would be an appropriate way to deal with that. And then as far as the existing terms of the approval, I listed out all of the previous conditions as they were set out in 2017. If anyone has comments specific to any of those kind of issues, I'm happy to speak to them. For the most part, our recommendation is not necessarily to change anything. There are a few items called out for the applicant's attention as far as some minor changes to the project, namely things of responsible parties for environmental cleanup and how those play out. And there was a condition for requiring that remediation waste not be stored on site or not be stockpiled on site particularly, but be live loaded out. We would continue to hold for that. So if, in fact, the Hammond Street property does have environmental contaminants on it, it would just be rolled into that same sort of approval.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, Dan, if you mentioned this and I missed it, but you had an initial question at one time about on-site groundwater monitoring wells. If they are going to be affected by the new plans, some coordination with Cumberland Farms, do you want to speak to it further?
Yes, so that kind of rolls in with what I was saying earlier about the fact that Cumberland Farms may need to do some level of testing at some point during this project to close out their end of it. The other issue is that there is a long-term monitoring network which includes monitoring wells on the site. And so developing an alternative monitoring network that works for everybody, particularly with the site footprint occupying most of the property and specifically around the contaminated areas. For reference, the fuel tanks historically were located on this, left of center portion of the property. And so that was the original primary source of contamination. There were quite a few wells over there. But I would think that if the requisite testing was performed shortly after, excavation and with construction dewatering and the data set that goes along with it, there may be a way of eliminating those wells from the program altogether. They may be relocating wells into the shoulders of the nearby roads. It's a coordination item, some of which may be necessary to coordinate with the town as far as road opening permits and access and things of that nature. But it really depends on how much additional testing Cumberland Farms thinks they may need, whether or not those wells need to be replicated.
So is this a note that we should be leaving for staff? I just want to keep track of what should we put in our conditions and what should we just have like as a note to staff regarding maybe a review and an approval of some documentation.
I would think that that's more of a review and approval at the building permit stage. They will probably be, as I recall, they were modifying some of the road openings anyway, so as somebody is reviewing the road openings, knowing that there may be some, drilling work in the street to put in additional wells, that would probably roll under that same element.
Can I want to just ask about one of the conditions in your letter. It's not one where you recommended any changes, but it just caught my eye because of some of the wording in it. This is on your page 5, 5253. Prior to construction, the applicant shall submit a design for the waterproofing system for town review. And it's the second sentence. The town shall inspect and verify the function of the waterproofing system to ensure its effectiveness. And the reason I caught it, I deal with design services, professional liability all the time. Whether that gets rewritten or not, what I'd like to know is what is the town, what's the town's interest, and what's this condition really accomplishing for us?
It's ensuring that there's no need to mitigate groundwater intrusion into the structure over the long term that would potentially put a load on the municipal storm sewer. If memory serves, that was the reason why that went in there, was that basically there was a series of conditions that related to ensuring that the building is, Mike referred to a bathtub. I prefer to think of it as a canoe. That the waterproof part is surrounded by water and the water stays out of it, as opposed to having to pump constantly and manage a water stream at a later point.
I mean, there's an aspect of that is sort of neighborhood protection, right? Because
right.
if Mr. Flynn talked about this a moment ago, that if we can avoid, if the project can, not disturb the level of groundwater that exists and underlying the other structures and properties, then that's a desirable outcome. That would be in the town's interest to see that gets done.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
You have anything else?
Not
You
specifically.
want to cover any points? Okay. Thank you. No more questions from the board? Mr. Flynn, my simple question to you is, you've seen the recommendations of the peer reviewers. Do you have any problems with conforming to their recommendations?
I don't. I think in general, what we've seen is it's a continuation of the conditions that were put on previously. There are some details associated with, adding the new property, but from our perspective, they seem like they're in line with what was previously put on the project for conditions.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? No?
Yes. Janice Khan, town meeting member from precinct 15. And I do have some questions about.
I'm sorry, could you go to the mic
Oh,
so that it can
sure.
be heard on cable?
Hi, Janice Khan, town meeting member from precinct 15. And I sat through most of the previous iterations, so I do have some questions. One was that at the time that the approvals were done, we talked about a 100-year storm and managing that water, and it was determined that this particular property was given sort of a pass on the 100-year saying that a 50-year storm would be probably more realistic in terms of managing. I am becoming increasingly concerned about environmental impacts of projects now. And one of the concerns of the neighborhood was that since the building is going to occupy this space and water now can't go into the ground in its normal way, I wonder about the discharge system for water. The original plan had a way to retain it and then slowly discharge it into the system so as not to overwhelm that. And I just want to make sure that there still is this in this current iteration of the project, now that we're taking up even more space, right, covering more space.
The tanks are typically sized to accommodate, the water that's supposed to, and typically they're slightly oversized to, I think, 3,000 square feet of, I don't want to say it's negligible, but, the tank size will typically accommodate that. We will confirm it, so we will confirm it, but I mean, that's the intent, is still use the same system.
Okay, so I guess my question is, since it's now occupying an even larger site, do we need to have a larger system in place or a larger tank for district?
The tank may increase, but it's not, it won't be like 2 tanks or anything like that. It'll be just a slight increase. That needs to be engineered inside.
Okay, so that is part of your thinking. Okay, great. The other thing I think comes into just project management during the building phase to make sure that particulates are monitored, that the site is watered down. It's all in the original plan, and that holds true too. The other thing is, I was really pleased to hear about the monitoring the noise levels, because that also, we have a very strong bylaw in the town regarding noise levels. And so I really appreciated the comment that if it is really significantly high for the neighboring area, that some sort of screening be put in place to sort of dampen that noise. I think there are a lot of people who live very, very close to that, besides the direct abutters. It's only a block away from the residential area, so anything that you can do would be appreciated by the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have any comments? Well, I think we've heard from the peer reviewer. We understand what we can understand. And at this point, I think the next order of business is continuing this hearing until September 11th, when we will hear about
Revised plans, architecture peer
the
review.
actual plans for the
Right.
building.
I just want to point out that this hearing is scheduled to close October 22nd, 2019. The applicant did ask if the ZBA would be willing to schedule the October hearing. If you think it's appropriate to schedule that, at least we can get it done. I know your schedules are busy. I will be asking for an extension, but not this evening, probably in September.
I don't think we have any objection to scheduling in October. What do you have in mind?
Okay, I'm just going to throw out some Wednesdays, and I don't have my holiday calendar here, so please advise me. I would start, so September 11th, giving us maybe 3 weeks, maybe the week of October 7th, so that's 7th or the 9th to start with.
I think the 9th is a Jewish
The
holiday.
9th is a
Okay,
Jewish holiday.
thank you. So the 14th or the 16th?
The 14th is Columbus Day.
I really don't have my holiday calendar.
The 16th
But the
is
16th
fine.
has nothing.
Okay,
Can you do the 16th?
okay, all
Do you
right.
want to aim for the 16th?
So we're continuing to September 11th, and our October hearing will be October 16th. Okay,
Fine.
thank you.
Then no further business before the board.
Can I just ask a question? Maria, on the September 11th, you said architectural plans, but is there also something coming back about the south, the Hammond Street elevation?
Right, so what we're looking at on the revised plans is that south facade, the.
Oh, okay. I
That-
thought when you
that's-
said plans, I didn't even.
No, no, I'm
Architectural
sorry.
drawings.
Yeah, we were looking at the
Architecture
elevations.
drawings. Got it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, drawings. Mhm.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.